Absolute positioning is a little bit different from relative positioning. And from what we've seen in the previous video, we can now discuss those differences. To begin with, I've opened up the absolute.html file, which is located inside of your source file's chapter 5 folder. Inside of position, you'll see absolute.html. Double-click it and open that up. Let's take a look at what's going on. First of all, if I collapse my files and open up my CSS styles, there's a div which is being defined for all the divs that we have here. And while it only looks like there's 3 divs, there's actually 4. Let's go to the code and examine what's going on. First of all, there are 3 divs, each with IDs of box 1, box 2, and box 3. Inside of them, they have headlines for their titles. However, wrapped around box 2 and box 3 happens to be another div called the container. Let's style the container first and foremost, and then get a sense of what we're going to be doing on this particular page. If you go to the live view, you can sort of see what that looks like right now. I'll ask you to go to the CSS styles. New CSS rule, and we are going to be styling the container div. Well, I'm not going to be styling this one in the similar fashion as the others. So first of all, let's give it a different background color. And if you apply that, you'll kind of see what it is. But I want to make it fairly large, so I'll go to the box and we are going to give it perhaps something like a width of 200 and a height of 300. Let's see what that looks like. Now you can see the boxes inside of it. Maybe I'm going to give it a height of 400 just to accommodate the other box soon enough. Alright, now as we saw in the previous video, we were able to position something relatively. Well, the big change about relative positioning was that when I move an item from its regular position, if you do so relatively, it still stays within the flow of HTML. So I'm just going to click OK for the second. We're going to come back to this container soon enough. But you'll notice here box number 1 has an ID as well, ID box 1. Let's specify what's going to happen with box 1. So I'll come to the new CSS rule and notice the ID is my selector and the selector name is hashmark box 1. If I click OK and we go to positioning, I'm going to set this to be absolutely positioned. Then I'm going to determine where this positioning is going to be placed. I can say maybe 50 pixels from the top and 50 pixels or even 100 pixels from the left. If I press apply, nothing's going to happen until we click OK. Well, let's see what's happened. Unlike the relatively positioned elements that we saw last time, when I place something in absolute positioning, it is removed from the regular flow of HTML. For example, notice box number 1 is the first thing on the top. If it was relatively positioned, I'd be able to move it over on the left, but the elements underneath it would still be underneath it. But when we place something as an absolutely positioned element, it is now removed from the natural flow of HTML. Now this doesn't seem to be all that much of a problem. Also, let me show you something else. If you select this div, you'll notice there's this little element right at the top. Well, inside of Dreamweaver, this allows you to move this around. Check that out. If I were to collapse this for a second and select it once again, you'll see in the Properties window, it's determining what the left position and the top position happens to be. And if I move this down, notice how the top position changed. If I move it to the left, notice how the left position changes. And even if you had this open and you saw the left and top position here, notice if I move it around, it's going to be dictating exactly where its position is going to be. Well, that's all real fine and dandy, and you might look at this and say, wow, it's amazing. That's exactly what I normally want to see. However, I do want to warn you, generally speaking, when you're working in CSS layouts, we don't necessarily jump to the absolute positioning as our first choice. And the reason being is we generally want to keep things in their natural HTML flow. And that means later on, if an element was to be made larger, the elements underneath it would be repositioned because of it, much like we saw with the relatively positioned elements last time. Now let me show you something else about this particular container. I'm going to relatively position it so that I can show you how to center an item on the page. Let's select the container, and you can double click it to bring up the rule definitions. So this is rule definition for container. What I'm going to do for the container is set its positioning to relative. Another thing that we'll need to do to center it on the page is to go to the box model. And in the category called box, where it says margin, I'm going to choose for the right and the left auto margins. And what does that do? It's basically saying relative to where I'm supposed to be positioned at the moment, what I want you to do is take into account the size of the browser, figure out my width, and then automatically take whatever's left over and place it on the right and left hand side as margins. So if we click OK, take a look at this. It's centered the element on the page. Now we can really see this in action if we preview this in our browser. And first we'll save the HTML page, and then we'll save the CSS page. Now look at what's going on. If I refresh this, check it out. Moving the element as I'm doing right now will keep the centered element, the relatively positioned container div, always in the center of the page. But remember, box number 1 is removed from the natural flow of HTML. So because of that, it is stuck in its position right here. Now, why this happens is because if we look at the source code again, box number 1, first of all, is not in the container. So its parent, the thing that's holding it on the page, is the body tag. Well, whenever you have an element that does not have a relatively positioned parent, then it will automatically be absolutely positioned against the body. However, container is a relatively positioned element. So what I can do is cut box number 1, Command X or Control X on a PC. And I will paste it inside of the container div. Now doing so is doing a couple of things. It's basically making the box 1 ID have a parent, in this case container, which is relatively positioned. What this will do is absolutely position the element according to its parent's position. So in other words, if we select this item and we see that in its properties, not the container rather, but the ID for box, we can see that its left position is 188 and its top is 32. That is 188 from the left edge of the container, and so much 32 from the top of the container as well. Now if I were to move that here or there or anywhere for that matter, you would see how that it is actually positioned. Look at this. I can even position it on the left outside of the box, minus 50 pixels. Now let's take a look at this inside the browser and see what that's done. Save the page, and then save the CSS file. Look at this. If I refresh this and now reposition the elements, notice how, because it's relatively positioned parent is holding it, it is now going to move with the parent. So that's something that's really important when understanding absolute positioning. And generally speaking, when we deal with layout in CSS, if you're going to use an absolutely positioned element, you normally have its parent containing element in relative positioning. Now when we come back, I'm going to show you a much more common way of working, and that's to use something called floats.